I'm Elise Dekoninck. I'm an associate professor in mechanical engineering at Bath, but I'm trained industrial designer. So I've got a design background, and that's what I'm bringing to that department. I've been there since 2004.
Industrial design, how's that? Because I guess it is a branch of mechanical engineering.
Yeah, so I studied industrial design, which was a BSc. So it was fairly technical, but very light compared to where I'm teaching now, the technical content. And a bit, I suppose, if you wanted to know a bit about my background, I think if I look back on how I ended up there, I was really interested in fashion as a typical teenager, and I had a lot of craftspeople in my family, so I made all my own clothes when I was about 6 till 16 kind of thing. From a really young age I was making things, and then but my parents were both physicists. They both studied physics, and they met at UCL in London, and so I think I could naturally do maths and physics, and I was getting good grades in those. And I was always interested in how the world worked, but I was a typical kind of teenager wanting to go into fashion. And I got studying product design at Brunel was a kind of compromise. It was a kind of a thing that, that was going to be somewhere between studying fashion and something a bit more hardcore. And it's interesting because a few years ago, I found in the loft one of those tests that you can do that profile you as a person. And at the back, it gives you all these careers advice, and it was literally like 8 pages of different kinds of engineering. And then there was product design and garden design and architecture and a few other things. But I just literally, as a teenager, I ignored the first 9 pages of engineering, basically, because I didn't think I wanted to do engineering. And now I've come full circle. I've been working in an mechanical engineering department for 18 years. So I mean, you'll have more insight on this. Do you think that people always end up where they're meant to be?
1000%. I think, where you end up is where you're meant to be. And it's so fascinating that you had an interest in fashion, because me too. And it's so interesting that you ended up in engineering. It's not a conventional choice for a woman. Why did you not get intimidated and scared off and kind of leave the industry of engineering?
Yeah. Well, this is really interesting, and I reflect on this quite a lot. So I grew up in Holland. So my dad was working for the European Space Agency. And so I grew up in the 70s and 80s in Holland, where they had this massive public push for emancipation. It was what it was called, and we got sort of indoctrinated at school, and there was a lot of stuff on you can do anything. Don't limit girls can do anything, like loads of videos of female firefighters and what have you. And also the 80s were quite androgynous in a way in the fashion. It wasn't very, it was a special time, I think. And so I was convinced, and also my parents always said yes to everything. So my sister and I were fixing motorbikes, fixing our own motorbikes and so on, as well as, making fashion. So it did span a range of different activities they weren't all classic female oriented things that I was doing at the time. I did a lot of, I did martial arts, and there were various things that were kind of very, kind of mixed, that weren't particularly feminine, or that were mixed. And the society in Holland was pushing really hard at the time to sort of correct this imbalance between male and female. But what was interesting is that they weren't as far ahead as as the UK was at the time, because my mum was one of only two mums in my primary school who actually worked. So they were doing a big public campaign to make things. So I honestly believe that we were living in a post feminism situation until about 6 years ago. I'd been sort of happily ignoring gender issues, even in engineering, because I thought I was just operating in a gender neutral way in my environment, never intimidated by anyone. And some of that is also because my dad is quite a big character. So dinner conversations were always very debates, So I'm always really comfortable in a room full of men and having, absolute debates. I don't even feel my gender at that in the room. I just am. But then obviously about 6 years ago, I start to see the stats and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, we're still massively going in the wrong direction. What's going on?
Yeah.
And also realizing that I have a role to correct or to change that. So I suddenly thought, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to have to engage with this because it's not fixed, and if anything, it's not moving in the right direction.
Gender issues are such an interesting thing because it's very, very multi-layered and it's so complex.
Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about your dominant, not dominant, but like large character of a father. Because I also have a very large character of a father. And I was just actually visiting them this weekend. And my mum kind of wants to take a back seat and just let him shine in social situations. But it means that she's very quiet. And I bring this up because I think it's really affected the way I want to be as a woman in society, because I don't want to take a back seat. And certainly as an engineer, I've done so much that I have a lot to say.
Yeah.
And I do find it very confusing looking at my parents and just going, why is my mum so subordinate compared to my dad when I know she's got a lot to give? Have you ever looked at your parents? If my mum was also a working mum. But have you ever looked at your parents and just gone, where do I fit?
Yeah, it's like, or more like the question for me is more like how have they influenced where I've ended up? And what was really interesting is that my mum, so my mum played a sort of supporting role for the whole family. She paid for my dad to do his PhD. She got a job after they graduated, paid for they got married. She paid for him effectively to, supported them whilst he finished his PhD. And then his career was always the one that made them decide to, move to America and so on. And then she would pick up the best work, the most interesting work along the way and do it kind of part-time, especially after she'd had a family. So she was like in the first bank in Chicago, the first bank in the world to have a computer. And she worked there. So she in her own right has got some really interesting bits of work, but she never had any ambition to lead or at work or anything. Like, so for years and years and years, she worked as a computer programmer in the Netherlands when we were living there. And, she had no ambitions to climb any kind of career ladder. And worked very much part-time, used to come home, and because in Holland schools had lunch breaks, and she would come home, she would drive to work, do a couple of hours, drive home, give us lunch, drive back, do a couple of hours, so she was very much her priorities were not on her career. But actually when I became a mum, suddenly I was like, well, this is a really important part of your life as a job, is to do a good job as a parent, and making time for that is also really. So I have much more empathy to the decisions she made along the way. But so yeah, it used to frustrate me in a similar way to you, that I used to ask myself the question, why doesn't she want something better for her career? Because my dad was having this amazing career in the space agency. I mean, he got to the last 4 of being selected to be an astronaut. I mean, it was just nuts. And then in contrast, she was, working as a computer programmer, going, not with, yeah, I mean, I don't want to be cruel because I've got respect for all the things that she's did as well, but different decisions and different roles in the family. So,
but
yeah,
it's really
taken me a long time to reflect on it.
It's really interesting hearing what your mum did, because I talked to many women on this series, and different women approach being a woman in many, many different ways. I remember having a conversation with a Russian lady who said she firmly believes that women should get children out of the way early, have children early, and then when they're grown up and they are autonomous, then you can get your life back. And she did a PhD in artificial intelligence really late in her career, sort of like late 40s. And her career completely took off, and she's like flying high in her own right. And then there are other women that leave it till late, and sometimes never do the family thing because it's been left too late. And so what's fascinating about your mother's story, and I can start to see how it influenced you, is that your mum was really essential for ensuring that your dad had an amazing career. And by playing that essential role, she got to have the children and do all that. So she probably didn't get all the cash and prizes for the way she was handling it. But what a new age way of doing things. I mean, she got to have it all, apart from the accolades. And it's kind of genius.
Yeah, but I also, if you think about all the Buddhist philosophy or anything like that, like the bigger picture, some people just actually are operating in a really wise scenario. They're not driven by cash and accolades. I can't picture my mum ever being driven by that kind of recognition. It's very it's that would have to be one I still need to ask her, is like, yeah, I can't really put my finger on that, but I think all of us are like, there's self-actualization, isn't there? Am I using the right term? And what drives us to do the things, like, am I genuinely doing this job because I care about other people's outcomes? How much recognition do I feel I need? I sometimes have those conversations with peers. There's a few senior academics who don't go for professor positions, for example, because actually as an associate professor, which is I've been now for 8 years or so, you can do any role in the university. I could go all the way up to vice chancellor level. I think you don't have to have the professor title, the full chair. So some academics, senior academics, they just let go of wanting that label, and they just get on and do the really interesting work where the work in itself is rewarding.
So, clearly you've been surrounded by some pretty impressive people, but I want to know more about you. I mean, you're a mother, you're an associate professor. I mean, how has it been juggling all of that?
There's a bit of a, do you want the fertility story? It's part of the story, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a premature ovarian failure, like probably so soon after I got married. When I got married, I was working in design consultancy, which is quite like stressful, and you have to travel at a drop of a hat to go and see clients and all of this. And I had I'd got my PhD, and suddenly there was a vacancy for lectureship, and I thought, I'd have just got married, and I was like, we knew we wanted a family, and I was like, oh, a job at a university is going to be more stable than in the consultancy, so I'll apply for this lectureship at Bath. I applied for one at UE as well, which is in Bristol. And anyway, so I applied for a couple of lectureships, and so then we bought a house, got married, we had a house, I had a stable job, I had all of this, and I was like, okay, we can start a family, like planned. And then discovered after 2 years or so, or a year and a half, had some tests and stuff, and discovered that I had had complete ovarian failure, like probably like 4 years earlier or something like that, probably an autoimmune disease. So I had absolutely no eggs and no way of having having a family without fertility treatment and a donor and all of that sort of thing. And but then 6 months later, or less than that, we were offered donated embryos, and unbelievably lucky, like, to straight away succeed with that first attempt. And so I had already spent 2 years thinking I would never be a mum at that point. And so getting pregnant just meant was just completely more important than anything career thing, because I'd gone through this kind of grieving process of thinking I would never be a mum, or never have the experience of being pregnant and all of that. So then I was the very, very exceptional academic at Bath who actually like took masses of maternity leave. I went back to work half time, which was unheard of. I handed over all my PhD students, all my papers. I handed them all over, didn't continue them. And people would ask, other academics who were pregnant would ask me, oh, how are you doing that? And I was like, well, I just don't care. I don't care about losing this job. It doesn't matter as much as this. And that was really rare. Really, really rare in academia. And I think it was because I'd already grieved. I just felt like it was such a bonus to have the experience of being a mum and having the full experience of like carrying a pregnancy, and and being able to do all of it was just a complete joy. So it just took number one priority.
Because I don't have children, and I basically always put my education and my career first, and as a result, time just ran away with things. And I then sort of like, because I think it's just my personal belief, but I think in order to have a family, you really need to meet the right person. And I didn't meet anyone during my sort of childbearing, really fertile years that I wanted to have children with. And I'm in a very happy relationship now, but it's kind of too late. It's a joint decision, and it's kind of too late to have children. And I think it's such a difficult time in a woman's life, when you're kind of saying goodbye to this idea of being a mum. And one of the things that's really helped is talking to mothers and them telling me that having children is amazing, and they love their kids more than anything that they've ever known to love. But it is not the be it and end all. Now, talking to a woman that's done both, you know, got this really interesting career that you sound like you have thrown yourself into, but also being a mother, like, what is the reality?
Oh, it was really bad for a few years.
In what sense?
Well, we had a head of department at the time, and we, as academics, we're on probation for 3 years, and I was pregnant during that time, and then I came back half time, and I failed my probation, or they had to extend it because I hadn't reached my targets. And at the time, again, they didn't have much track record with people coming back part-time. They just extended. I came back half-time, 50%, and they set the same targets but extended me. Instead of extending my probation for 1 year, they extended it for 2 years. So that was like a 5-year probationary period that I was on, and all the time you feel like you're being judged, and you know, and all the metrics, and that's pretty awful. And actually, if you're part-time and you're working 50%, you've got just enough time to check your email and deliver your teaching, so you don't have big chunks of time to write grant proposals and do all the things that they were actually measuring us on, you know, big things like doing big research projects and bringing in funding for research, and writing you know, journal papers and things. Whereas now the university changed their policy quite a lot. So instead of extending someone like me for a longer period with the same KPIs, they now realize they have to adjust put your performance indicators proportional to the proportion of work that you're on. But at the time, they were just making it up because they hadn't really come across cases like me very much before. And I had a head of department who was misogynistic at the time, but that person didn't last very long.
And that was all because you wanted to really devote your time to being a mum, given everything you had gone through.
Yeah, I went to like toddler groups and things, and all of my colleagues who who I've watched have babies in the last 18 years have completely missed all that out. They breastfeed whilst writing a journal paper. You know, and they never let go of their PhD students. They didn't really hand them over, so they're like constantly during maternity leave, they're like reading chapters of people's PhDs. And no, I don't really see any other people who've let go like I did.
And do you have any regrets of the way you threw yourself into motherhood?
I don't have any regrets, because although I was on probation for 5 years, and it felt hairy at the time because they can potentially let you go at any stage saying, no, you're not good enough, sorry. 5 years later, I made senior lecturer, so, which is associate prof, you know, which is the position I'm in now. So actually, I did really well. Did really well, but I'm still in the middle of parenting. I've got like a 15-year-old, and I'm actually going through some hairy stuff, you know, like there's still so many stages to go through until he's completely an adult. So yeah, it's still really exciting and a bit terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm never gonna know what that's like, and I kind of really hang on to the words of mothers, in knowing, because, you know, you asked me before, like, you know, about destiny, and looking back, I made all the decisions I made because I didn't know any better. And, you know, I just find that the whole motherhood topic is such a really big deal when it comes to women in STEM and probably women in careers. But, you know, I'm from a STEM world. And so I'm really fascinated to know how women do it, because I think I was in a generation of women that were trying to figure it out. Like today, you get young 20-year-olds who are already freezing their eggs. Whereas I was in a generation where the technology for freezing your eggs was kind of being developed. And so I never thought to do it in my 20s. And so the technology is there. I wouldn't now do it in my 40s, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I kind of want to shed light so that anyone watching this episode can make better decisions for themselves based on what we've both been through. I mean, we're different in the sense, okay, our similarity is that we went into engineering, right? But we're different because you wanted to tick all of these boxes, whereas I was like, I can't possibly tick the motherhood box because I'm too focused on like trying to figure out my career stuff. So well done you for juggling that as well, because I couldn't fathom it.
Yeah. Well, there were a few really big influences. Like when I joined Bath, I had a senior colleague who's the head of design, who I fell under in mechanical engineering, who was unbelievably family oriented. And I remember being absolutely shocked because I came in from the design consultancy where everyone was like hip. It was all like hip and trendy and like fast moving and prestigious, you know, and little bit glitzy and stuff. And I came in and we would be having meetings, and this is with a professor of design, head of design at mechanical engineering in Bath, quite an important role. And whenever his wife phoned, he would just always pick up the phone and be like, "Oh, hello, love." It's just like stuck. And I remember the first time it happened, I was in complete shock because the whole meeting was being interrupted by his family life and the love for his family. You know, and he would always ask me about, like, the first thing would be a conversation about family and home life. So he definitely flipped things on its head in terms of, you know, career and professionalism and all of that. Was like, oh, family first. So that was quite an influence. And then what I do now is, you know, because I look after a lot of people, I'm head of design myself now, is I talk about pace a lot. And I'm really lucky in academia because it's a really long, slow career, and we've all got caught up in the speed at which the world is working. So I've got a lot of young colleagues who are applying for professor now, you know, and they see it as every 5 years they want to make a big promotion, and actually what used to be is like you used to get the professor role was a kind of end of your career, like this is your global standing. So it was like there's only 3 steps, there's only 3 promotions there's only 2 promotions almost in academia. So like if you achieve them all within the first 15 years, you know, it's not really necessary to achieve them at that pace. So I talk about pace all the time when I'm doing performance reviews. It's like, are you doing this at a pace that's sustainable to you, where you can actually balance the other things that you want to do in life, like maybe travel or see family or have a hobby or keep your body healthy, you know, because it's so easy to be completely absorbed in your career. It seems more important than everything else, but actually everything else allows you to perform in your career. So I have to, I have to remind people of that. I have to flip that on its head quite regularly.
Every woman needs to have a very strong sense of what she wants. Whether she gets it or not is separate, but I think it's really important. I've experienced this. It sounds like you've also gone through that process of like really figuring out how you want your life to look. And then, once you get a clear sense of that, like, opportunities come your way and you can either choose to grab it or not, and all of that. And so that's, I think, the main sort of take home message I've got from chatting with you today, is that it's really important to figure out your own values, your own objectives in life, and other people may have very different ideas for their own life, and that's okay. It's not a commentary on you, or other people shouldn't affect your ideals. So with that said, then, like, is there anything you would do differently? Imagine there's a younger woman who's watching this, being really inspired by your story. Is there anything that you would say, just be careful of,
Oh, God. I think what was springing to mind whilst you were making a nice summary, is that be open for your own values to change. Like, don't set it all. The only limit I would say on what you've said is, like, don't get too locked in. Keep checking in with yourself, like, what really matters to me at this stage, what's really important to me. Like, I've had it took me many years to decide whether I wanted to go for another promotion, for example. And I think, because like you said, knowing what you want and then moving towards it makes sense. That's what can drive you. But it takes, allow yourself to reflect and change those goals as you move through life, because you're going to be massively influenced by the things that happen along the way, right? So yeah, it's shifting the route occasionally when it feels right, when it's important to do so.
Do we need to change the public perception of engineering, or was it a case of you fitting into something that you're really passionate about, and yeah, you're not conventional, but you may do? Like, which one was it?
Yeah, I think I was just lucky to have been exposed to a lot of different things from when I was young. So I think that's really important, and I think that has a really big effect. Like, visiting European Space Agency, where my dad was working, and seeing all the labs where everything was being built, like everything from satellites and so on, that all being, and then at home, like I said, working on motorbikes, and so that was already like a bit of a spectrum at the time of exposure to engineering things that I didn't even put an engineering label on, and maybe I should have done, because then maybe I would have chosen engineering to start with, which I didn't, because I just didn't know what engineering was. And yeah, and there's a massive problem with that, is that I can see now that my son comes along regularly to the department, and he comes regularly to uni, and almost none of the other kids around have that experience or background, so they don't think it's normal. They're just not used to seeing it. And so if you just normalize exposure to these things, and then find out that has a major role in making the world a better place, and making things work, and making things happen, and solving the climate crisis, and sorting out healthcare technologies, and curing cancer, and that actually that's where you get into it, is just to go to places like that where you can experience and be part of some kind of engineering environment. So we just need, everyone needs to visit, basically. Just keep I don't know, being in the environment and starting to see it as normal, rather than tucked away in a specialist lab somewhere.
Thank you for being the person that is trying to normalize women going into engineering, and women doing what has traditionally been seen as very masculine subjects. And thank you for doing it with a grace and a warmth and a empathetic approach to engineering, because I really feel that is what is lacking in engineering, and it's women like you that are really changing the face of engineering in a direction that we have so desperately needed for so many decades. Elies, thank you so much for being such an inspirational role model in engineering, who has really shown that it is possible to have it all. It's not easy, but it is possible, and what is required to have it all is a real sense of knowing what you want. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for interviewing me. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions about you and find out more about you, so it's kind of frustrating from my side.